Tom Tunstall Allcock, thank you so much for joining me on the Real Clear Values podcast.
Hi, Tom. Thanks for having me. You're very welcome.
Tom, I'm really excited to have this conversation because this is going to be following on from a conversation I had with Sean Fear, who is a lecturer in international history at Leeds University, my alma mater. And you are, as of fairly recently, a senior lecturer in American history at the University of Manchester. Just to kick things off, Tom, I'd like to talk about how America got involved in Vietnam. So the road to the war in Vietnam, as I talked with Sean about last week, was quite a tortuous one, and there were many different players involved, many different turning points. But how did America get involved in this fairly small country in Southeast Asia?
Well, first of all, I was going to say I'm really glad that you've spoken to Sean already and I've got that Vietnamese perspective in there, because I will be talking a lot about the American perspective, and it should be very clear that this is not a story that's just an American story. This is the Vietnam War or the American War as it would be in Vietnam. I think it's just as, and not more significant for the Vietnamese people than it is for the Americans. So I think that's really important that that's in there as well. So I'll feel better now about talking just from an American perspective without feeling like that side of the story isn't being addressed, and that's brilliant. And I think I can probably make things slightly less long and tortuous when it comes to thinking about the American side of things, and I'll try to keep it fairly straightforward without going into every possible detail. Because the story of the history of Vietnam and its relationship with neighbors and with foreign powers goes back much further than American intervention. There's been conflict within Vietnam for long before the United States gets involved, but probably the place where it becomes most relevant for the United States is that during the 19th century, Vietnam and neighboring countries become colonial possessions of the French. During World War II, when Japan is expanding into Southeast Asia, the French are pushed out. During that time, you get a resistance to the Japanese led by a man called Ho Chi Minh, and leading the Viet Minh in resistance against the Japanese. And at that point, Ho Chi Minh and his Vietnamese fighters are, of course, on the same side as the United States because they're fighting against the Japanese. So there's cooperation there, there's working with the United States agents. And really where things become the kind of crucial moment at which you start to see which way the United States is going to be going on certain issues in the region, that at the end of World War II, Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh declare independence and say, well, look, we have beaten the Japanese, we've won our freedom, we're going to declare independence, and we're going to look to the United States as a country that supports, freedom from colonialism, and look to them for support in creating this newly independent country. But of course, at the same time as that's happening, we're also entering the early stages of the Cold War. The United States has this growing rivalry with the Soviet Union that's soon going to take over much of global international relations, really. But at this point, the United States is very aware that allies are going to be important. The French are an important ally, and the French decide at the end of World War II, we want back into Vietnam. So the Americans, under President Truman at this point, essentially back the French, or at least give the French assent to go back in and reclaim their colonies, ignore Ho Chi Minh's claims of independence, and the French go back in. You get this very long, bloody war with the French trying to reestablish control. Now, another reason why it's significant they don't support Ho Chi Minh is that Ho Chi Minh is a communist. He's a follower of communist teachings. And again, when you've got these early stages of the Cold War and it's starting to take shape, this rivalry between the US on the one side and the Soviet Union on the other, it's not helpful if you are a known communist to be asking for help from the Americans. So that's a kind of initial stage. So already you've got the sense that the United States is not particularly amenable to supporting Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam. The next big stage really comes in 1954 when we have the partition of Vietnam. And this is when the French, finally defeated, unable to keep fighting, pull out, sue for peace. There is a series of peace talks that end up dividing the country in two, with Ho Chi Minh in the north, in a country that is communist, allied to the Soviet Union and China by this stage, and a southern Vietnam, which is connected to the West, backed by Western powers, but particularly backed by the United States. So this is what happens when you have the Democratic Republic of Vietnam in the north, and the Republic of Vietnam in the south, but it's easier probably just to say North and South Vietnam because the names are essentially meaningless in terms of which is democratic or which is not. Neither are basically democratic. But the key point at this stage in 54 is that you have one country which is connected to the communist powers, and you have one country which is connected to the non-communist powers, the Western world, the United States. And that division and those alliances are what really is going to drive American intervention over the next few years, because over the next several years, what basically happens is there is no reunification, which had been the initial plan, and a rebellion begins in the south, led by communists to try and overthrow the government in South Vietnam under a man called Ngo Dinh Diem. I'm sure you've heard all of this from Sean already, but from the US perspective, at least, this becomes problematic because from the perspective of the United States, what we're seeing is a country allied to the West, standing up to communism, but being undermined by a rebellion from within. And that rebellion is increasingly supported by Ho Chi Minh and the North Vietnamese. So what is essentially a civil war between Vietnamese over the future of their country is given this global relevance by the fact that one side is allied to the West and one side is allied to the East. And increasingly, the United States is going to get more and more involved in backing the South, supporting the South. And we can talk a bit more in a little bit about what that looks like. But the basic principle is there is a commitment to back South Vietnam, and increasingly they're going to commit more and more there until they get drawn into the conflict to start fighting there themselves.
Yeah, that's really interesting. One of the things that I've taken as common wisdom on America's involvement in the Vietnam War is something that you've already alluded to, Tom. This idea of the domino theory, that if these countries in Southeast Asia fall to communism, if you like, then they're all going to fall, and then that's going to play into the global spread of communism. And the Americans, from a geopolitical point of view, maybe some might say from a hegemonic point of view, global governance point of view, want to nip that in the bud. When I was speaking with Sean last week, however, what was quite interesting was that he was saying that as America increasingly got into the war and they got deeper and deeper involved in the war and had the sort of levels of soldiers in there that you'd see in Full Metal Jacket and films like that, it was more about Lyndon Johnson's concern about domestic politics and the desire to project American power, American strength abroad. What would you say about that, Tom? Because I think this is quite interesting, and it would be interesting to get your perspective on this from an American point of view. What's really driving this over time? Would you say that it is primarily the domino theory, or would you say that there's more to be said about Johnson's concern, LBJ's concern about the situation at home?
So it's worth saying, and we don't need to go into this in huge amount of detail, but these are questions that have been debated for decades by historians in literally thousands of books and articles, and you'll read 1,000 different opinions on them. So this would just be my take of the best of synthesizing some of those things that I can do. Certainly, there is a worry about the domino theory among some policymakers early on. It's an idea that's first sort of articulated during the 1950s, really under Dwight Eisenhower, this idea that, dominoes fall. Once one country falls, others fall, and therefore you have to hold the line to make sure that you prevent this kind of collapse through the whole of Asia. Now, of course, there's no way to prove whether that was a correct theory or not, because it doesn't happen at that stage. That there is not, Vietnam does not become a communist country until the mid-70s, and some people argue that by buying time, that prevented the domino theory happening. So it's possible to know whether it's true or not, but certainly it is a concern. But why I think it's important to even go back to that starting point and talk a little bit about Eisenhower and also Kennedy as well, before we even get to Lyndon Johnson, is that the United States is deeply involved and deeply committed in Vietnam well before we get to Lyndon Johnson's presidency. So he's the president who first sends in official combat troops and says the United States is going to take on some of the responsibility of fighting this war. But Eisenhower is plowing millions of dollars in military and other aid into South Vietnam. Kennedy is sending military advisors, which by the time Kennedy is assassinated, there are 16,000 American military advisors in Vietnam. and they're doing a lot more than advising. They are going on combat missions. Americans are fighting and dying before Lyndon Johnson gets there. So there's this kind of increase of engagement that doesn't quite peak with troops until Lyndon Johnson, but he's not someone who is an aberration in terms of how he's handling the situation in Vietnam. Essentially, what happens is the situation in South Vietnam gets worse and worse. Eisenhower, Kennedy, and initially Johnson try and just stave off any need to intervene by sending advisors, by sending money, by bombing in some cases. And ultimately, the situation gets so bad where Johnson is told, you have to either send troops or pull out. And the decision he makes to intervene. And that's the point where you get, I think, this really crucial idea about, well, why does he then make that call? What is so important here that rather than saying, well, we've tried, we've spent millions, probably billions of dollars, we have had advisors, we have tried to support their government, nothing has worked, therefore it's time to cut our losses. And this is where things become a little bit more complicated, and where I think certainly there is a great deal of domestic political interest going on. And Johnson would say, and did say this at the time, that his great fear was that if he was seen to lose Vietnam, then he would be vulnerable to attack from the right at home, and his Great Society programs, his domestic progressive legislation would be kind of assailed on all sides, and he would be crippled as a president. There is some precedent for this, and he would point to Harry Truman, who when China, when the Chinese Communists, when the Chinese Civil War in 1949, that Truman's domestic legislative agenda was really quite badly affected by that. He would point to Eisenhower coming under a lot of criticism following the Cuban Revolution in 1959. But again, it's one of these situations where, you know, certainly he felt that way, and some of his advisors, I think, also felt that way. But, you know, subsequently, I think a lot of historians have looked at this and said, actually, you know, Johnson's in a very strong position when he makes a decision to intervene. He's just won a resounding electoral victory. His domestic policies are pretty popular, at least among kind of his base, and he has widespread support. He could have decided to withdraw at this point. So there is other things going on. Domino theory is still there. Domestic credibility is there. There's also this idea of international credibility. I think that's just as important to keep in mind. This idea that within the Cold War, deterrence is really important, and being seen to be strong is really important. So there's a sense that if we pull out, then what good is our word elsewhere? This phrase paper tiger gets used a lot of, well, we might look scary, we might say that we, you know, will defend our allies around the world, but if we just pull out as soon as the going gets tough, then what's our word worth? Again, a lot of other allies are telling him that's not true. Charles de Gaulle is telling him just to get out. But there is this sense that there's domestic credibility at stake, there's global credibility at stake, and that there is kind of a genuine risk. You know, I think it's quite easy to be quite cynical about what the policymakers thought, and there definitely should be, because there's a lot of quite unpleasant things going on. But I do think there is a genuine belief among a lot of American policymakers at this time that communism is a genuine global threat, and it needs to be combated.
Yeah, interesting. There's a couple of things that really leap out to me in this discussion, Tom, just in terms of America's drivers, because America's been very heavily criticized from various different quarters as being this great hegemon, or this big bully that wants to position itself as a great power. But what it sounds to me from what you're saying is that this is very much driven by, if not fear, at least risk aversion and risk mitigation, protection, rather than a desire for imperial power. Would you say that's fair?
Yeah, I mean, I think one way to think about it is that, I mean, to go up to sort of the classic teaching history as an introduction to kind of long-term causes and short-term causes, right? And the kind of big picture stuff and the sort of more immediate decision making. And certainly, I don't disagree with some of the historians who would place Vietnam and intervention in Vietnam in a kind of broader pattern of you know, U.S. hegemonic behavior, and you know, and certainly economic imperialism, and you know, the Cold War, as much as a battle of ideologies, is also a battle for whose economic system is going to be dominant in the world. And you know, the US benefits from the more countries that are within its economic sphere and trading sphere. You know, it is all benefits the United States. So I certainly don't disagree with the idea that there is definitely that aspect to it. But when we're looking at the kind of immediate decision making that Johnson is making, certainly in this sort of 64, 65, 66 period, which we're really getting the kind of ramping up and that intervention to what we sort of know or would think of as the Vietnam War at its height, of American soldiers on the ground fighting in South Vietnam. Yeah, I think at that point, I don't get the impression that he is thinking in those big picture terms about America's global empirical role. I think there is that it is fear about the consequences of withdrawing.
Yeah.
Made worse, I think, for him. And now, you know, if we want to get, I can talk about Lyndon Johnson as a man and as a president for hours, because he's an absolutely fascinating character. He has a reputation for being pretty dreadful when it comes to foreign policy. I think that's actually a bit overstated, but he's certainly not as confident as someone like John F. Kennedy when it comes to kind of making maybe bold judgment calls on foreign policy. So I think there's a degree of kind of the individual in there.
Yeah.
But also a lot of, say, the structure of American foreign relations and American policy in Vietnam at this period has been, we contain communism, we support our allies, we do what it takes to back South Vietnam. So you do have this build-up of precedent that he's following, and there is genuine anxiety and a fear of what will happen if he doesn't.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, interesting. So let's get into Vietnam itself, the country and the Americans in Vietnam. You mentioned that to start with, well, the Americans had a long history of being involved with Vietnam at some point. I mean, I think even FDR was talking with the French, wasn't he, in relation to what was going to happen to Vietnam after World War II, and FDR was very much against colonialism and imperialism of all, certainly the traditional senses of colonialism and imperialism. And he gave Churchill a good run for his money in trying to decolonize or try to dismantle the British Empire. So there was a lot going on there historically. I picked out a quote recently. I've started reading a biography of Dwight Eisenhower by the Gene Edward Smith one. And there's a quote that I saw from him from 1954, where he said, "Our most valued, our most costly asset is our young men. Let's don't use them any more than we have to." I'm not sure if that's grammatically correct, but I'm reading that verbatim. So yeah, so let's not use them any more than we have to. So there wasn't this, I think it's really important to make this point that America wasn't going in all guns blazing to start with. So could we talk now a little bit, Tom, about America's approach in Vietnam in terms of supporting the South against the North and doing the fighting, and how did that change over time?
Sure, and I think it's really important. So that point that Eisenhower, I think Eisenhower was in a very strong position when talking about issues like this, because he was, he was essentially the most experienced military leader in the United States. He'd been Supreme Allied Commander during World War II, and as president could speak with a huge amount of experience on this. And one of his great positives of his presidency would be so that with a few minor exceptions that are a bit debatable, he would say he did not send American troops into combat. He did not send American troops to war during his presidency. Again, some historians might say there's a bit of nuance to that, but basically he didn't. And you see that continued reluctance to a degree under, that Kennedy is much more happy to send advisors than he is combat troops. And it is this big wrench that Johnson, having gone through the 1964 election campaign, promising not to send American troops, and painting his rival Barry Goldwater as the extremist who would lead America into war, eventually he very reluctantly does send American combat troops. So certainly, yeah, there is not a desperate rush to send combat troops in. And really, the early stage of American involvement were about trying to build up the South Vietnamese forces. So initially, Kennedy's advisors are there to help fly helicopters, train the South Vietnamese army how to use weapons, to have maybe one or two people accompanying them on combat missions and trying to combat the insurgency in the South. The problem is that by the time we get to the mid-60s, it's becoming clear that this is really going to be enough. That the Viet Cong, as they are known by the Americans, the South Vietnamese rebels, are being well backed by the North Vietnamese and the North Vietnamese regular troops, and being well supplied. And that it's just becoming clear that the South Vietnamese army with just American advisors isn't going to be able to cut it. And probably the big change, and the moment that really is going to mark the real American commitment to the war, is when the bombing campaign of Rolling Thunder starts. And this is And again, this is where I think we have to be quite clear about what an almost a strange war the United States ends up fighting here in Vietnam, because it's not an all-out war against an enemy that you want to invade, occupy, defeat. There's a couple of different parts to it. And one is that the United States is trying to get the North Vietnamese to stop supporting the rebellion in the South. But they are never at any point considering or willing to invade North Vietnam, because that would escalate the war to another level. And as Lyndon Johnson is absolutely terrified of, might bring China into the conflict as well. And as I think subsequently we've discovered, he was right. Had he invaded, the Chinese would have responded, and we'd have potentially been looking at World War III. So the North Vietnamese are an enemy, but you're not invading or fighting the North Vietnamese directly. But the United States and Lyndon Johnson is willing to bomb them. And the idea of the bombing is that we will, if we bomb North Vietnam long enough, they'll want to talk, they'll want to negotiate, and they'll want to stop supporting the South. That's the idea. And at the same time, the other element of the war is that you're fighting an insurgency in the South. That's guerrilla warfare. That is people who know the territory, who know the terrain, who are not engaging in direct combat, but are fighting, say, a war in the Vietnamese countryside. But again, you are not fighting an enemy you are trying to eradicate and invade and occupy. The goal of the United States campaign in South Vietnam is to stabilize South Vietnam and leave it as an independent, strong country with its borders protected. But how that war is being fought, it is destroying much of South Vietnam. So one of the major problems you have with the war as a whole, and the biggest problems the United States has with this intervention, is you have these very badly defined goals that are very difficult to pursue. So the idea is we're going to bomb the North, get them to stop supporting the South, and fight this conflict in the South to defeat the insurgency there. And ultimately, they're not able to do either. And there's several reasons why that is, far more than we'd have time to go into here. But what a lot of it comes down to is really not understanding the conflict they're fighting and not having, I'd say, sensible, achievable goals or a clear idea of how they're going to do it. So just for instance, the idea of bombing the North in a lot of ways stems from ideas, and it sounds a bit odd, but it stems from ideas about modernization and development that have been quite important in the thinking of United States foreign policy certainly in the late 50s and early 60s. And what drives that idea is this idea that every country is looking to modernize and develop and build up their industry and become a more modern, economically productive country. So part of the plan for bombing North Vietnam is we're going to hit factories, we're going to hit supplies, we're going to hit their just growing economies. This is going to damage them so badly that they'll be desperate for us to stop and they'll sue for peace. Problem is, the North Vietnamese care far more about reunification than they do about factories, and they're also being continually resupplied by the Soviet Union and by China, who are replacing oil, munitions, all the supplies the United States is destroying as quickly as they can destroy them. So there's just a fundamental misunderstanding of what that bombing will do. It's never really likely to bring the North Vietnamese to the table. And at the same time, we have, again, you see some of these ideas about modernization playing out in the South as well. But you have, so under Kennedy, this starts, you have what's known as a strategic Hamlet program that Sean might have spoken about. This idea of that we're going to help modernize and defend South Vietnam by moving people out of their homes and into these defended, but also kind of modern villages. Again, it might sound okay in principle, but in practice, a lot of the time you are tearing people out of their homes, moving them from where they'd lived, and putting them in, to be honest, if you see the pictures, look like fairly grim, almost prison camp-like place with barbed wire and armed guards. So it's hugely unpopular, even though it's about trying, from the United States perspective, kind of trying to modernize and save this country. You're also at the same time using things like defoliants to try and remove the cover that your enemy is using. But what that means is you're destroying half the forests and countryside, again, of the country that you're in theory trying to develop, build up, and save. So this is all a very long-winded answer of saying that as the United States gets drawn into this conflict with these basic principles of kind of build up, protect the South, stop the North supporting this rebellion, there's not really any point at which there's the kind of, you get the impression that there is a kind of a stopping and kind of reassessing this and really thinking, is this possible? And are the tactics that we're pursuing actually going to achieve these goals? And it just becomes increasingly clear that they're not.
Yeah, it's interesting what you say there about things like Operation Rolling Thunder and how the bombing campaigns were put in place with specific ends in mind, but not that clearly defined goals, and goals that weren't really realistic in view of what else was going on. It's as if they didn't know the full chessboard. They didn't know what was going to be relied upon, and also the values of the North Vietnamese as well. Thinking that, well, if we damage them economically and we damage them industrially, that's going to be more important than anything else, which of course it wasn't at all. Like you say, they were about reunification, national sovereignty, and also having this particular form of government in place. So it seemed as though it was very difficult from that point of view to achieve any sort of outcome like the United States wanted to.
I would say, and Sean probably said this far better than I can, but I think it's fairly clear that the planners and the North Vietnamese government understood the Americans much better than the Americans understood them. The basic idea became, we can lose 10 of our troops to every one American, and the American people are going to get sick of this long before we do. And we're much more willing to fight this war of attrition than the Americans are. I think that proved correct. And the American idea that the North Vietnamese could be bombed into submission and that American firepower would win in South Vietnam, both just proved to be incorrect ultimately.
Interesting. That leads on nicely to the next thing I'd like to talk about, Tom, and that's the way in which America was fighting this war. And like you say, destroying the flora and the fauna in the country that you are supposed to be protecting is not a good way of winning hearts and minds there. So what sort of things do the Americans do that really turn people against them besides that? Because there's all sorts we could go into here, but what I understand, I've watched the majority of Ken Burns' documentary on Vietnam, and what I understand is that there were all sorts of things that the Americans did that were extremely, and not just antagonistic, but that would really could make sworn enemies of people in the south of Vietnam, whether it's erroneously bombing certain places or killing civilians or roughing people up that they shouldn't have done, or acts of barbarism on the ground. Of course, there are acts of barbarism on both sides in the war, but how does this really change? What are some of the key things in the United States approach that really change how the Vietnamese people in the South who were previously supportive saw them, and how the American people start to see America's cause in due time as well?
First of all, congratulations on making it through that much of the Ken Burns documentary, because it's an amazing achievement, but it's a lot of time.
Yeah,
it's a big time commitment. So and maybe we can talk a little bit in a moment about kind of why maybe some of the violence of the Vietnam War has been kind of remembered so vividly or portrayed so repeatedly as it has, because I think there's some interesting things there about how unique this violence is really. But it comes back, I think, to this idea that we've sort of mentioned just briefly, that the United States is fighting a war all within the confines of South Vietnam, because they're not attacking North Vietnam with troops. So it's American troops operating within the confines of South Vietnam, fighting against what they see as an insurgency. And that is an enemy who's not wearing uniforms, who is not declaring themselves, who is not lining up in the field for battle in any sort of traditional way. So from an American point of view, it becomes an almost impossible situation where soldiers are unable to tell the difference between civilians and the enemy. There's plenty of other issues going on as well about how young many of the American troops are, how badly trained and underprepared, certainly as the war drags on, of actually, how well trained, how well prepared the Americans who are there are. And then you have the broad strategy, which becomes to combat the insurgency and combat the guerrilla tactics, which becomes known as search and destroy, which is basically sending American units out into the field with the goal of going and locating Vietnamese and killing as many as they can, essentially being as destructive as they can, and often with the pretty indiscriminate use of air support. And so that includes, we've already mentioned, the use of defoliants, but also things like napalm, or just airstrikes, missile strikes on areas. The kind of tactics which, you know, this is not precision warfare. This does not tell the difference between, you know, a civilian and a combatant a lot. So there are lots of civilian deaths, often accidental, but I think as you alluded to, and certainly as would have been featured in the Ken Burns documentary, certainly not always accidental. And this becomes increasingly clear in the late 60s, when these key moments of atrocities become public knowledge. So the My Lai massacre is the most famous, which but is certainly not a unique event. One of the worst, but you know, there were other incidents of soldiers, essentially just American soldiers simply entering villages where they may have been told there was a presence of the enemy, but essentially murdering, raping, killing women, children, the elderly, and committing pretty brutal acts of, you know, war crimes, essentially. And these tactics, again, when the idea of the war in the South is to try and defeat this insurgency, bring the people together and create a strong South Vietnam, you know, with the best will in the world, this is not going to happen. You know, there is a lot of talk about winning hearts and minds, but how do you do that when for most Vietnamese, their early encounters with American soldiers, you know, unless they live in the cities, their encounters with Americans are as these forces on these search and destroy missions. You know, again, I've not done research into the Vietnamese experience, and Sean can speak to this better, but even if you were someone who was either more inclined towards supporting the government in Saigon or the Americans, or you were just completely neutral and you didn't really care who was in power, you know, the American troops are not doing a great deal here to win you over with the destructive tactics that are being used and the sort of violence that's being employed. Now, I would say that I don't know that necessarily the violence being committed by American troops in Vietnam is worse or more extreme than in other conflicts. And there's certainly things we can talk about there about the coverage of that, and how it was reported and who was seeing it. But because it's being fought all within South Vietnam, because there is this sense among American soldiers that it's difficult, so hard to tell the difference between who is an enemy and who is not. It does think it's much more concentrated in civilian areas than perhaps other conflicts have been or may have been. So yeah, so certainly in terms of the basic strategy within South Vietnam is one that is incredibly destructive, and one that's incredibly difficult to then win the Vietnamese people over to your side.
This is interesting, and especially interesting in the context of what's happening in Ukraine at the moment. We've been shocked and appalled by what is happening there and the acts of barbarism that have been perpetrated by Vladimir Putin's Russia and the troops over there, and even on the troops on the Russian side who don't want to be fighting in that war. What strikes me as particularly awful are the stories of people being raped and elderly people being raped. America has always at least positioned itself, that the persona of America has always been that it's on the side of right. How then did it ever get to that? How did it get to the point where those troops felt that they were justified to perpetrate those acts in Vietnam?
So I suppose the first thing to say would be that I would never say there is a point at which anyone would be justified or possibly even feel justified, and that these are. It also, I think, is important to state that I think because certain acts of violence being committed by American troops in Vietnam have received a large amount of coverage. There was, you know, the My Lai massacre led to a court-martial of William Calley, of one of the officers involved in the My Lai massacre, that became a huge national story and a kind of real point of sort of almost pre-culture wars over kind of what this trial meant. And subsequently, popular culture has returned to the Vietnam War over and over again, and often focusing on those acts of violence. There is a danger, I think, of overstating how extreme or how even out of the ordinary the acts of violence that are being perpetrated here by American soldiers are. Because I think, and you touched on this when talking about Ukraine, that there is no conflict, no extended conflict like this that is fought in civilian areas and drags out over weeks and months where you do not get atrocities and violence against civilians, or at least I'm not aware of one. And what becomes really interesting about the Vietnam case and the trial of Cali is that some of his biggest defenders and the defenders of American troops who are being prosecuted for war crimes committed in Vietnam are World War II veterans who have a reputation, this idea of the kind of greatest generation idea, right? That this, exactly as you said, the idea that American soldiers are heroes, are liberators, are, you know, marching into Europe, handing out chocolate bars to children, and liberating prison camps. And, you know, that's a very powerful image of American troops from World War II. And there is truth to it. But also what, say, a lot of World War II veterans say when these trials start coming out of these stories of atrocity in Vietnam start coming out, is American veterans saying, well, if these kids are on trial, we should have been on trial too. We did things that you would not want to hear about. This happens in every war. And there becomes a real debate about Vietnam, whether, is this something distinct and unique about the Vietnam War? Or actually, is this just a type of violence that gets perpetrated in every conflict? And because of the media access to Vietnam, which we see television crews in a war zone for the first times ever, broadcasting on the day, you know, what has been happening, that there are photographers present at My Lai and in other incidences too, that are we just getting an insight into things that have always been going on? Now, I think there is something unique about the violence of Vietnam to an extent. And we've talked a little bit about how young some of the soldiers were, how inexperienced, the nature of the conflict where there's that blurred line between civilian and enemy. Some people might point to some of the, you know, the widespread drug use. But ultimately, I think there's it's as much a story about what an extended war does to people and the violence that it engenders. Let's say Vietnam is in many ways a story of a conflict that just gets attention and has evidence and images that maybe wouldn't have been present in a war like World War II, which becomes much easier to then portray as, you know, the great noble cause, whereas Vietnam is this much murky and more difficult conflict morally in many ways. And then when you add the evidence of these atrocities and this violence into it, it creates this much more powerful idea of this war that is in some ways just more horrible than other wars.
Yeah, that's a very, very interesting point, and one that's really worth bearing in mind, Tom, especially when you link that back to World War II as well, because we have it's very easy for us to have a rose-tinted viewpoint of World War II, and there were some there are well-known things in World War II that the Allies did that were absolutely awful, really awful, such as the bombing of Dresden and things like that, for example, which were really, you might say, beyond the pale. Even though, okay, you're fighting against the Nazis and Hitler and everything and all what they did and were doing, but nevertheless, there's no absolute virtue on any side in a war. So that's a great point to bring World War II. Also, the point you make as well about the media coverage, I think that is absolutely essential. Now, accepting all of that, I think another question that I'd like to dig into, Tom, is how does the Vietnam War change the way that Americans see themselves? Because I've had conversations with other academics outside of the podcast who've mentioned that the Vietnam War is quite an axial moment in terms of how people see how Americans see themselves, and even some start to engage in revisionist history where they hark back to the New Deal and say, well, maybe the New Deal wasn't so great after all because it prolongs this horrible capitalist machine. So how does, just to reiterate the question, Tom, how does the Vietnam War change the way that Americans see themselves?
That's a really interesting question, and I think just as a starting point, you know, I think the debates around the Cali trial are a really interesting kind of illustrative point in this, that you get this kind of cultural moment where there are commentators, veterans, politicians weighing in on the idea of even trying American soldiers for these incidents, and there is a real struggle to incorporate it into what's essentially been a kind of myth of American exceptionalism, right? It's a very powerful idea in the United States, and I've been for a long time, that the United States is different to other countries. Its soldiers are different. It goes to war for different reasons. You know, we go all the way back to World War One, and you know, and Woodrow Wilson had described that as a war to intervene for the preservation of democracy, right? It was about saving democratic principles in the world. And then World War II had been quite an easy conflict, right, for FDR and the Allies, again, to make this very clear moral distinction. We're fighting fascism, we're fighting Nazism, we're fighting Japanese militarism, and we are the democracies, and, you know, and we are the ones who are fighting on the side of good. And it's a very compelling and very powerful narrative, and it also taps into a lot of the histories of the United States more broadly, from founding, from manifest destiny. You know, lots of ideas about America as being different and special. Every country has their own national myths. I'm not saying that America is any worse than anywhere else, but those ideas have been very powerful for a lot of Americans. So yeah, so there is this moment of kind of grappling with what the Vietnam War means. What does it mean that we're now fighting in this conflict where we don't really know what our end goal is, where we are dropping thousands of tons of bombs in North Vietnam, where millions of Vietnamese are dying. We don't know what the end point is, and now we're getting these stories of mass atrocities. And of course, you got to remember as well, it's provoking mass protests at home. That by the mid 60s, there were already a major protest movement, and by the later 60s, you know, there is a huge groundswell of opposition to the war. It's hugely divisive at home as well. So yeah, so there is very much a sense that the Vietnam War is difficult to fit within that narrative on the one hand, and I think, and I'll come back to that point in a minute, but also that it's in many ways an end point to this sort of trajectory that the United States has been on of going increasingly powerful, intervening initially in World War One and then World War Two, being victorious each time, and ultimately end of World War Two really reshaping much of the world. And there's this phrase that sometimes uses the idea that the period after World War II is there's this illusion of omnipotence. This idea that, right, whatever we put our mind to, we can do. You know, the United States has to. We have the capacity, the willpower, the economic strength, the military strength to do essentially whatever we want. And the Cold War has been increasing, and has been about increasing commitment worldwide, that we're not now just containing Soviets in Europe, we're now containing communism in Southeast Asia, in Africa, in Latin America. The commitments have grown and grown and grown. And the Vietnam War is this point at which those kind of costs really come home, and the limits of American power are demonstrated. And without wanting to oversimplify things, this is why a lot of people kind of point to the 70s as this kind of almost this sort of decade of malaise, right? Where there is almost a kind of crisis of confidence among American politicians, the American people, of, you know, what is our role in the world? What is our purpose? That, you know, they're essentially defeated in Vietnam and have to withdraw. And that legacy, the fear of intervention, hangs over American foreign policy for years. There is a series of other setbacks, things like the Iranian hostage crisis, that's seen again as kind of being these damaging impacts on American world power, economic challenges. And it really takes until Reagan comes into office or runs his campaign and explicitly makes his campaign about rejecting all of that malaise and self-doubt and reclaiming America's global powerful role. So I think for some Americans, certainly, I think the Vietnam War kind of shattered some illusions with long-lasting consequences. But I think for others, it was maybe a moment of doubt and questioning. But then what Reagan really did, and with the kind of real resurgence for American conservatism in the 1980s, was actually to challenge that narrative and say, no, we were right to intervene in Vietnam. He literally uses the phrase noble cause and says, you know, we were preventing dominoes falling. We were right to defend the South Vietnamese, and American veterans of that war should be celebrated in the same way as veterans of any other war. So Reagan explicitly makes the effort to pull the Vietnam War back into that myth of American exceptionalism, American engagement. And I think that's been very effective for a lot of Americans. You know, we don't see a kind of pulling back of American interventionism in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, right? We still have this, these periods of interventions. And yes, Vietnam is often harked back to, and it's a talking point. Will X intervention be another Vietnam? But I think that is much more of an issue for the left, for liberals, maybe, who are questioning that role and questioning American intervention. But what Reagan's, I think, really does for the right in America is to kind of pull Vietnam back into that myth, says, forget all the stuff about My Lai and atrocities and violence. Remember that we were there to defend democracy from communism. And really, there is a sense in which, for some Americans at least, there's been a rejection of that.
Right. So he was almost saying our intentions were good, and that's good enough. Mm-hmm. Something to
sure. And then it's also very much tied into a kind of cultural conservative renaissance, but also a revisionist take in the historiography of Americans, usually more conservative scholars, arguing very similarly to Reagan that intervention was right, the United States did the right thing, and actually quite a lot of work saying we also could have won, but here are the reasons why we lost. And there are various places that blame is placed. Some cases that's the media, it's liberal politicians for being too willing to bend to public opinion, or critical media coverage. There's accounts that argue it should have been fought more unconventionally, more like guerrilla warfare. There's some that argue it should have been fought more conventionally, like traditional warfare. But either way, there is this push of opinion saying, no, actually, it wasn't just a big mistake. We could have won. We were right to be there. And therefore, it does fit within our idea of kind of American exceptionalism, that we are on the right side of history. And, there's something very appealing in that. And saying, and Reagan really runs with those ideas and saying uses it because he wants to kind of have this re-energized, newly aggressive United States again, which he does, and a lot of that is about pushing away that legacy of Vietnam. And his successor, George W. Bush, literally says, with the intervention in the first Gulf War, he says, I think we've kicked the Vietnam syndrome. I think Americans are no longer scared to intervene again.
Interesting. And maybe easy for them to say, perhaps, maybe easy for Reagan and Bush to say that when they weren't in the hot seat. So just to take that point on, how does the Vietnam War affect LBJ, Lyndon Johnson, the man who was in the hot seat?
Poor Lyndon Johnson. I've got a lot of sympathy for him. I think because there is a degree, I mentioned this already, of Eisenhower and Kennedy both essentially kick the can down the road with Vietnam. They don't cut ties, they keep escalating involvement, but they never reached a point at which the decision has to be made, go in or pull out. It's Johnson who that lands on, and ultimately he's the one who does decide to go in. But for him, it really, it's the ruining of his presidency. He's in a bit of a reputational resurgence because of what he achieved domestically. He is the president who passed the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act, Medicare, Medicaid, federal aid to education. He was a hugely transformative piece of legislation domestically. Whether you agree with a lot of his policies or not, not many presidents have achieved as much as he did in terms of legislation. But Vietnam is the kind of shadow that hangs over his presidency that ruined his reputation. And he was eligible to run again in 1968 for the presidency, and he announces in the spring of 1968 that he won't be running again. And that is essentially because Vietnam has become such a toxic issue. It's so divisive domestically, and there is so much opposition to him within his own party, within the Democratic Party, that he knows he's very unlikely to win re-election. That he essentially as well, he just can't face it. I think that of what a challenge and what difficult it's going to be. He's facing challenges from within his own party. So really it is the ruining of his presidency. And now we haven't talked quite about sort of the ending or the later parts of the war, but I mean, the Tet Offensive is probably the sort of the big turning point in that in early 68, there's been talk through late 67, early 68 that the war is being won, that there's light at the end of the tunnel. As he's saying, he's brought back the commanding officer of American forces in Vietnam, General William Westmoreland, to kind of do a bit of a press tour and talk about how well things are going. So this is kind of almost in build up to the 68 presidential campaign, Johnson trying to lay the groundwork to say, look, we're getting there, we're winning. Then in early 68, the North Vietnamese army and the Viet Cong, the NLF, launch a series of attacks throughout South Vietnam, which militarily are not successful. They're actually beaten back, and the American and South Vietnamese forces win most of those conflicts. But what it demonstrates is that this war is nowhere near one, that the war is going to drag on, that the forces of the North Vietnamese and the South Vietnamese insurgents are still capable of doing this. And this is when then there is, I mean, there's some debate about what the exact turning points are, but from this point onwards, really, you have a shift in media coverage, a shift in public opinion, and I think Johnson too, as well, acknowledging he's done as a leader and he can no longer do this. And so people vying for the presidency in the 68 election are then going to be instead putting forward their plans or what they will do in order to either win the conflict, get America out of the conflict, to do something other than keep fighting it, because Johnson has proved unable to win. And even though he makes some efforts to try and find peace deals in 68 and the rest of his presidency, as a lame duck president who's not going to be re-elected, he's quite limited in power and leverage, and he's also unable to find a peace deal. So yeah, so his presidency essentially is ended by this conflict.
Yeah, and you wonder what effect it had on the man himself, because if I recall correctly, he didn't die too long after he left office, did he?
72, 73, I think, yeah. And he left office in January 69.
Yeah, so yeah. My understanding of it is that he was quite haunted by some of those decisions that he made. I think Doris Kearns Goodwin talks about this in her writing. Yeah. And it's quite interesting, her take on it, because she had quite an intimate insight on.
I think there's definitely Vietnam is a huge part of it, and certainly I think there would be guilt and regret with some of those decisions. And I'm a big fan of Lyndon Johnson, but I would say he's also a huge narcissist and egotist. And I think a large part of that was just his despair at the end of his political career. You know, right. I think he is, you know, on a human level, you know, I think he did regret some of the decisions he made, but I do think a large part of that was for the damage it did to his presidency. That, you know, his whole political career, he'd worked his way from essentially growing up in poverty in rural Texas to becoming an incredibly powerful senator during the 1950s, desperate to be president, finally gets there. He'd not had much of an interest in foreign policy, always knew his goals were to be a transformative domestic president, and then his presidency is ruined by Vietnam. So I think Johnson could be very self-pitying, and I think there is a large degree of that. But I think he was essentially just ruined by this. Yeah, he goes back to Texas, back to his ranch. He'd quit smoking and massively cut down on drinking after he'd had a heart attack in the late 50s. After he leaves the presidency, he essentially starts smoking again, starts drinking again, grows his hair out. Have you seen the pictures of him? He has this kind of long, white hair. Right. I read quite an interesting analysis of it about someone comparing it that Johnson had essentially embraced the kind of hippie lifestyle and grown his hair out. I don't know about that, but essentially you did really get the sense of a man who was just beaten and broken and just sort of let himself go, and sort of retreated to his ranch. They say this was the man who his whole career had been building up to the presidency, and then he leaves it, in disgrace. So there is tragedy there, but so as much as I have sympathy, much as I like Lyndon Johnson, I think a lot of his pity would have been for himself, when obviously there's far more tragic for the young American soldiers and all the Vietnamese, who died as a result of this conflict. So I have sympathy for Johnson. I have far more sympathy, for the victims of the war.
Absolutely. That image that you portrayed there of Johnson on his ranch, smoking, drinking, long white hair, sits in stark contrast with the image that Robert Caro paints of Johnson in his early career in politics in Washington, running towards the government buildings there on the Capitol. Really quite interesting, because you see there in Caro's writing the drive that this man has for power, and then he gets the power, of course, but it ends in such a way that he doesn't want it anymore. It's quite extraordinary that he doesn't run for a second term in office when he has fought tooth and nail, and quite meticulously so, to gain power. Even in high school, even when he was in high school, this Nietzschean phrase, and Nietzsche's features quite heavily on this podcast, talking about values, but this will to power that he has seems to be incredibly strong within him, almost insuppressible. So
he's one of them, and this is why I think, if historians go back to him again and again, and so why I go back to studying Johnson again and again. He is one of the most fascinating characters in American history, and so in the presidency. And there's a phrase kind of that's described as the many Lyndon Johnsons. That one of the things that's so interesting about him, that he is this person of so many sides, and some of them incredibly admirable, and many of them pretty deplorable. And a lot of the time, he's his own worst enemy. So yeah, he has this drive for power, this ambition, and you see it in his ability to get things done that no one thought was possible. There's stories of how when he was leader of the Senate, he was the kind of ultimate deal maker, politician. You do occasionally hear sort of analysts in the US, Democratic analysts, kind of lamenting that we don't have a Lyndon Johnson, that Biden doesn't have Lyndon Johnson, Obama didn't have a Lyndon Johnson, someone who just gets things, who understands power, understands the levers of power, and makes things happen. He was incredibly talented at spotting opportunities that other people hadn't for power. So for instance, the leader of the Senate, before he took on the role, had been a pretty kind of ceremonial position. He realized that actually there were quite a few kind of levers of power that they had access to. He took on the role and made it the most powerful politician by the president, and really transformed the role into making himself kind of this term. If you've read the Cairo books, master of the Senate, he makes that role of leader of the Senate the one it is today, which continues to be today, with pretty problematic consequences over the past few years. But that's a result of Johnson's kind of drive there. But also, he's hugely insecure. He's incredibly sensitive. He takes things very personally. He can't handle media criticism. He creates enemies easily. And a lot of the time, that when things start to go wrong, those traits cause you a lot of problems.
Yes.
I think you see a lot of his worst traits and worst aspects of his personality in some of the Vietnam decision making. That he is, in some ways, quite overawed and also quite hostile to some of his advisors he inherits from Kennedy, who he sees as these kind of overeducated private school boys, where he went to teacher training college and never went to any of these sort of posh prep schools. In some ways he's kind of overawed, in some ways he's quite resentful of them, but he never really gets kind of a grip of his own set of advisors, the own foreign policy advisors, and relying on Kennedy's. And as we talked earlier, that then is often making these decisions out of anxiety, out of fear of these imagined consequences, and then as he gets more entrenched into these decisions, lashing out at anyone who offers alternative advice or criticism, or what he sees as disloyalty. So I think in terms of leadership, some of those are really not good qualities, of not welcoming that alternative advice, of not being willing to reconsider your position. And so you see the strength of Lyndon Johnson in the presidency, particularly with the domestic legislation, but you do see, I think, those weaknesses on thinking about sort of big strategic foreign policy decisions. It is not where his strengths lie.
That's a fascinating point that's a bit tangential to this, but I think it's worth making, in the sense that from a leadership point of view, is that leaders can, if they're not careful, if they do have that sensitivity and they are quite thin-skinned in relation to criticism or alternative viewpoints, they can very quickly be surrounded by liars, essentially, people who either deliberately convey false information, false opinions, false judgments on things that toe the party line, or people just simply withhold information. They withhold vital information that's necessary for the greater good. So really interesting points that are drawn out there, Tom. Thank you for that. Just in terms of the end of the war, then, just bringing things to a close a little bit. One thing that stood out to me, I wanted to check this with you from your perspective as well, was at the end of the Vietnam War, Sean was mentioning his view that really what did for the Americans and the South Vietnam at the end of the war wasn't so much the military side of things, the military strength aspect of things. It was more about the internal corruption in the South and in the Southern government. And that's really what hollowed it out. It was that lack of political legitimacy. What would you say to that in terms of the cause of the America and the South's failure in the Vietnam War?
Yeah, I mean, I think Sean would be much better placed than me to speak to this. And there's been some really good research recently into what has quite long been neglected, which is the sort of the period from sort of 69 onwards in South Vietnam, and what actually the South Vietnamese government looks like. So I think there's a bit more of a nuanced picture emerging, but certainly the goal of creating this stable country that could survive independently of vast American aid just simply never happens. There is never a sense that there's a government that has widespread support with, outside of the major cities, also or a government that's not entirely reliant on the United States to survive. And Nixon's strategy from 69 onwards is this idea of Vietnamization, which is that we are going to empower the South Vietnamese to fight this war themselves. We'll start scaling back American presence while building up both the South Vietnamese government in terms of kind of technical expertise and training, but also the South Vietnamese military, so we can leave them to either continue fighting the war themselves or defend themselves in the future. The reality, I think, is that what actually Nixon ends up realizing fairly quickly is that's never going to happen. And what really Nixon is trying to do is get them just to the point where it's called the decent interval thesis, of basically get them to the point where they're strong enough to not immediately collapse the second American forces leave, but give it long enough to be able to say, well, we did our part, we left them in a strong position, and it's their fault if they're unable to keep fighting. So that's where you see American combat troops leave in 1973. And then it's a couple of years later that finally, the North successfully invades and reunifies the country. So yeah, I don't think that there was ever a point at which the South Vietnamese government and as a country was strong enough to survive. And I think it's also pretty clear that the Americans were well aware of this. So by even fairly early in Nixon's presidency, and it became about how do we get American forces out without doing it so suddenly that there's immediate collapse, and give us a little bit of time to kind of have sort of plausible deniability almost. Now, the strategy kind of doesn't quite work for Nixon because for other reasons, he's out of office by the time North Vietnam successfully invades and reunifies the country, and it lands on Gerald Ford to deal with that. But I think that's the idea. So I think certainly from the American point of view, there's very little sense that actually we're going to win this and we can win this, certainly by the time of the early 70s and near the end of Nixon's time in charge.
Yeah, very interesting. It's such a fascinating topic as the Vietnam War. There's so many complexities to it. It's little wonder that the Ken Burns documentaries amount to about 18 to 20 hours or so. I'm sure they could have been much longer if there wasn't some heavy editing going on as well, not least because of all the media coverage that was put out and that was captured and then broadcast out from the war. So final question then, Tom, putting your teaching hat on for a moment, given that the Vietnam War is such a complex issue, there are so many complexities to it and so many nuances to it, thinking about your students then and thinking about students who you might teach and you might have taught on this particular topic, on this particular subject, given that the Vietnam War is so complex, what are some of the principles or the lessons that you would hope that they would take away from the Vietnam War and apply in their thinking or just in everyday life?
So I think what most often when I'm teaching this, I'm teaching it as part of a course about the presidencies of Kennedy and Johnson. So it's often within the context of presidential leadership. So a lot of the time we're talking about the importance of an individual within a decision-making structure. So how significant is it that it is Lyndon Johnson rather than John F. Kennedy who's the one who's in the hot seat when we reach this point? How contingent is it on factors such as Kennedy wouldn't have been thinking about re-election, but Johnson was? how much of these calculations play out into how a president makes decisions. And then to think a little bit about, well, what are the factors they should be considering? What are the calculations they should be making? While thinking about doing something as serious as, committing American forces abroad. And generally they end up, I think, coming out with being fairly critical of Johnson's decision making, but also understanding that it's taking place within some really problematic bigger frameworks, and that there's some serious problems with American foreign policy principles in general. Because I think if nothing else, and we touched on this a little bit already, but the intervention in Vietnam doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's the kind of culmination of many years of American growth of its global role, its commitments, and it is, I think, evidence of overreach and of a willingness to intervene without fully understanding the consequences of what exactly it is you're getting involved in. I think the fact that you see, when you try and break down actually why the United States is entering the conflict, what they're trying to achieve, how they set out to achieve them, and how likely they are to achieve those goals, it all falls down pretty quickly and crumbles fairly easily in terms of thinking that this is going to be a winnable conflict on the terms that they are fighting it. So there are problems there about individual decision making, but also really structural problems about how American foreign policy is being made, and why so many people are unable to see these flaws, certainly at least until the war is well underway, when many American policymakers then start to develop quite a lot of hindsight. But there's only really a handful of people who were saying in the early 60s, this is going to be a disaster, when really far more people should have been able to spot that. And I think there's plenty of lessons there about understanding why you're intervening, how you're intervening, and really having much more questioning as to whether you should be intervening at all. Honest was a bigger question about if you do feel that an intervention is necessary. Possibly Johnson's biggest mistake is that because he's unsure about it and doesn't really want to intervene and would rather it be done quietly, he doesn't make any attempt to really rally the public behind the cause or explain why the United States is intervening there. And he misses out on what sometimes termed the rally around the flag effect, which is, if a president goes to Congress, goes to the American public and says, we have to go to war for this reason, you often get this kind of groundswell of support. This never happens with Vietnam because it's done essentially in these kind of gradual stages. It's not quite covert, but Johnson would rather it be not get a great deal of publicity, not be any great fanfare around American troops going. What that means is as they start getting drawn deeper and deeper in, more and more casualties, public opinion turns against this war far quicker than most of the conflicts, in part because of the nature of the war, but also in part because you haven't got that kind of groundswell of intervention, a support for intervention that comes when you're able to explain your case clearly, state the reasons for intervening, whether they're true or not. All right, Woodrow Wilson, Franklin Roosevelt, famous landmark speeches kind of rallying the American people around a cause. Lyndon Johnson, no speech when the first American troops are sent into land. It is a very different type of conflict, and that becomes a problem very quickly. So so I can leave that there.
So much. Thanks for that, Tom. There's so much to draw out of that in terms of leadership and some of the pitfalls of leadership, and really interesting when you put it like that, how there was no rallying speech that spoke to this common cause, and how that maybe does indicate that the assumptions were faulty behind the reasons for going in the first place, and the fact that America probably was overstepping the mark. I was talking to Sean last week about how it seems to me as an outsider to this that it was destined to fail, and that it wasn't. I mean, he the way he put it was that hearts and minds of the Vietnamese people weren't for the Americans to win or lose, because so much depended on what was happening in the South. And it sounded like the Americans were going into this, they kind of strayed out of their lane, so to speak, and they were going into this situation that was very, very complex, very fraught with difficulties and contentions internally within the country and within each part of the country as well. So many things to learn from it. Thank you so much for your time and your insight, Tom. It's been fascinating discussing this with you from the American perspective. Plenty more that we could have talked about, no doubt, but but we have time limits on these things. So nonetheless, plenty for us to chew on. So thank you again, Tom, for joining me on the Real Clear Values podcast.
Thanks for having me on, Tom.